Excellent. Warm welcome, everyone. We're now live. My name is Dr. Shakur. I'm a GP in Blackpool. Many thanks for tuning in tonight to this special web meeting on unconscious bias. Over the course of the next half an hour or so, we hope to have a bit more understanding on the topic and start a dialogue on what is an important topic. Our keynote speaker today is Mahmoud Mebs Ahmed, a friend of mine who's very kindly given up his Wednesday evening, just like the rest of you watching, to actually explain more about this topic. It should be quite a friendly, interactive sort of session. He does have some prepared slides, so if you could watch them and give your attention to that. But at the end of that, we hope to have some sort of a discussion, interaction as to where we can move forwards with this, and if there's any questions on anything he said. Please do use the chat function. I hope many of you are familiar with Zoom, but if not, do familiarize yourself with the controls at the bottom. And it's quite simple, really, just to put your chat there. And if you can keep yourself muted, that would be great, just for the time being, until a time when you may need to speak. Without further ado, Mebs.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Mebs.
Great stuff. Okay. I'm really grateful to Haim for tonight's opportunity. It's only come about really while we were discussing the subject of unconscious bias and some of the work that I was doing with Edgell University. And I've done this presentation to a number of universities that work collaboratively on unconscious bias. So that chat with Fahim led me to tonight to share my thoughts on what some might see as an uncomfortable subject, but I hope that what I have to say and what I have to share with you is of some use to you and of some interest to you. The session tonight is basically around raising our own awareness of unconscious bias, or UB, which is used quite a lot, the term. If after tonight there is further interest, and perhaps we could look at further sessions around where do we go next, and I'll talk about that later in the next steps at the end of the presentation. I know that most, if not all of you, may be wondering who Mebs is, so please allow me to tell you a little bit about me. Fahim, next slide, please. Fahim, can you hear me? Thank you. Okay. I'm a retired police officer. I worked as an operational officer for Lancashire Constabulary, and from the operational side, I was actually given the portfolio of workforce representation for Lancashire Constabulary. From there, I went to lead what was called the Lancashire Black Police Association, which is an internal sport network. I'm sure you have lots of different sport networks within the NHS. And my work with the Lancashire Black Police Association allowed me to actually look at how we provide support for our black and minority ethnic staff within Lancashire Constabulary, to look at the recruitment processes and to look at their career progression as well. When I retired from Lancashire Constabulary, I went on to work for Staffordshire Police as a civilian, and I became their Equalities and Inclusion Officer, which again, a lot of the work was around workforce representation and coordinating internal staff support networks and the wider equality and diversity agenda. I have been retired now for quite a while, a few years now, but I am still involved with, as I say, Edgell University. I'm part of their service user and carer group. I also mentor people from all sorts of backgrounds and of all ages too. Locally, I also run a debating society, and with the recent pandemic, I have managed to finish my first book, which is an autobiography, and it's now at the publishers waiting publication. I think that's enough about me. Next slide, please. Fahim. I've already shared my personal background with you. So what we're going to be looking at is what is unconscious bias, and then I'll follow that up with a short story, which is about how it manifests itself. And then we'll be looking at forms of unconscious bias within the workplace. And as Fahim has mentioned, we will have a sort of like a question and answer session discussion, and then look at some next steps as well. I have to point out that I will be, as you've already seen, I'll be reading from my notes, so I will be losing eye contact with you. Please don't allow this to distract you in any way. Thanks, Fahim. Next slide, please. So what is unconscious bias? There are lots of definitions about it. This one is a particular favorite of mine, and I think it's quite plain to see what it says and what unconscious bias is. Unconscious biases, as there are several, are the underlying attitudes and stereotypes that people unconsciously attribute to another person or group of people that affects how they understand and engage with that person or that group of people. Before I go on, before we move on to the next slide, I'd just like to say a few words on equality, diversity and inclusion, or EDI generally. EDI has been and remains a sensitive topic. For a variety of reasons, talking about it or discussing it can be difficult. Some people simply don't want to talk about it. Others feel uncomfortable. I have known people who have become very uncomfortable during conversations or discussions on the subject. Others worry that they may get the language or terminology wrong, while some are afraid of being wrongly labeled or judged. All of which can make it difficult talking about EDI. I think it is a shame that in our multifaceted society, such attitudes or a climate of fear exists, when basically we are only really sharing, discussing, and learning about difference. Knowledge of which can only make us better informed and more aware of each other. Sadly, my experience of EDI training, with its heavy emphasis on legislation and what people can or can't say, has done little to encourage conversations between different groups. In my humble opinion, open and honest dialogue is exactly what we need if we are to learn and better understand each other. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. I now have a short story to share with you. Looking at those slides, could anybody guess what the title of the story might be? I know you're all muted, so I'll carry on. The story is called A Hindu, a Muslim, and a Hamster. Sometime in the mid-1950s, there were these two boys born in neighboring countries. Until 1947, their two countries were just one, India, where people of different faiths, Christians, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, had all lived peacefully side by side for many years. However, in 1947, India was divided into two separate countries, India and East and West Pakistan. This meant that those Hindus and Sikhs living in what became Pakistan uprooted and moved to India. Some Muslims from India went in the opposite direction. If only it was that simple. There were many atrocities carried out on both sides as millions of people left their homes and fled the violence from their former neighbors. Some estimate that well over 1 million lives were lost before, during, and following India's partition. There then followed decades of war between the two neighboring countries. It also led to a further partition, this time of Pakistan. East Pakistan eventually became Bangladesh. The two boys were born into countries in conflict and at war with each other. They were born into an environment where they were constantly told stories of how cruel and barbaric the Indians or the Pakistanis were towards their people, how they were attacked and butchered by those Indians and those Pakistanis. Everyone around them constantly telling them how bad the people on the other side were. It is not surprising that the boys grew up with hatred and loathing for those on the other side of the border, not too dissimilar to those living on the opposite sides of war-torn countries in many other parts of the world. Some years later, not necessarily at the same time, the boys' family chose to migrate and leave their prospective countries to seek a better life elsewhere. Both families settled in England. By sheer coincidence, the boys not only ended up in the same town, the same school, but also in the same class. Each time they looked at each other, they were consumed with hatred. Whenever they saw each other, it brought back those terrible feelings that had been created by those around them in India and Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be wondering how I know the story to be true. I know it is true because I was one of those boys. Our behavior went on day after day. I believe that if we got the chance, we would simply have torn each other to pieces. Thankfully, we were too frightened of getting into trouble with our teachers, but more so with our parents. So we simply expressed our feelings to each other through our eyes. Then one day, about 3 months later, our teacher brought her pet hamster into class for all the children to see. Unfortunately, the poor thing somehow got out of its cage and got lost. To look for it, our teacher paired up the children. Yes, you've guessed it. In her wisdom, she paired us up together, unaware of our feelings towards each other. As we were the only two Asian children in the class, it made sense for her to pair up Shantilal with me. However, as we both stood up when the teacher called out our names, and for some reason, when I looked at Shantilal this time, I didn't see a boy that I loathed and hated so much. This time, I saw a boy with greasy black hair and brown skin, who more than anyone else in the class looked like me. A boy who also had the same shy and uncertain look in his eyes. This time, as I looked with more than the previous distasteful and momentary glances, something changed. I remember thinking and asking myself, of all the children in my class, why do I hate him so much? As a child, I didn't know, but at that precise moment, something unexpected happened, which I am unable to explain even today. A nervous and uncertain smile broke across my face. To my huge relief, the same unsure smile came back from Shantilal. To cut a long story short, ladies and gentlemen, from that moment on, we saw each other very differently. Something inside us changed, helping us to see each other in a very different light, and we became close friends. To cap it all, it was Shantilal who found the poor little hamster, frightened and hiding under the heating pipes in one of the storage cupboards. The point of the story? Well, as children, we didn't realize that we were forming perceptions, very negative perceptions of each other's people, because of what those around us were telling us, leading to so much hatred. It was so easy to do. All around us, people were telling us how bad or awful the Indians or the Pakistanis were. This constant feeding of those from the other side subconsciously started to form our perceptions, which led to influencing our attitudes and behaviors. This can start to happen irrespective of who we are. If we are exposed to an environment or circumstances where prejudice and hatred are displayed towards those different in some way, it can become our norm, our unconscious bias. In some cases, this may even prevent us from engaging altogether with those different to us. Sadly, in some extreme cases, this can also lead us to become abusive or violent towards them. What was drilled into me by those around me formed my perceptions of the Indian people, and without knowing it became my unconscious bias. However, I was fortunate. My environment and circumstances changed when my family moved to a country where so many people live side by side, irrespective of their race or background. I was also very fortunate to have met Shantilal. That meeting opened up my mind to my unwarranted and unnecessary prejudices towards the Indian people. If my experience with Shantilal and all my years of working with people from a variety of backgrounds has taught me anything, it is that we should never rush to judge those different to us based on what little we know about them. Yet it would seem that many of us are afraid to engage with those different to us, often because we may get something wrong. Yet from my experience of people, they don't mind you asking for things that you may not know about them. Most are happy to share something of themselves. Most, if not all, are also prepared to forgive sincere mistakes. What offends people is when we judge, stereotype, or label them based on our limited or often inaccurate knowledge about them. This short story is about two boys from two different racial backgrounds. However, unconscious bias isn't limited to just racial difference, which leads me nicely onto the different types of unconscious bias, or UB. Next slide, please, Fahim. There are 16 different types of unconscious bias that commonly affect people within the workplace. I am sure you will already be familiar with most of them. Some of you may think are just plain common sense. There may be a few that you may not have heard of. Again, please bear with me as I read them all out. Affinity bias, also known as similarity bias, is the tendency people have to connect with others who share similar interests, experiences, and backgrounds. Ageism is the tendency to have negative feelings about another person based on their age, both younger or older. Anchor bias is when someone holds on to an initial singular piece of information to make decisions. Attribution bias is a phenomenon where you try to make sense of or judge a person's behavior based on prior observations and interactions you've had with that individual that make up your perception of them. Next slide, please. Authority bias. This refers to when an idea or opinion is given more attention or thought to be more accurate because it was provided by an authority figure. Beauty bias. It is a social behavior where people believe that attractive people are more successful, competent, and qualified. Confirmation bias is the inclination to draw conclusions about a situation or person based on your personal desires, beliefs, and prejudices, rather than on unbiased merit. Conformity bias is the tendency people have to act similar to the people around them, regardless of their own personal beliefs or idiosyncrasies, also known as peer pressure. Next slide, please. Thank you. Contrast effect is when you compare two or more things that you have come into contact with, either simultaneously or one after another, causing you to exaggerate the performance of one in contrast to the other. Gender bias is a tendency to prefer one gender over another. Height bias or heightism is a tendency to judge a person who is significantly shorter or taller than the socially accepted height. Name bias is the tendency people have to judge and prefer people with certain types of names. Thank you. Nonverbal bias is the analyzing nonverbal communication attributes such as body language and letting it affect a decision or opinion. The halo effect is the tendency people have to place another person on a pedestal after learning something impressive about them. The horns effect is the opposite of the halo effect and is the tendency we have to view another person negatively after learning something unpleasant or negative about them. And finally, the overconfidence bias refers to a person's tendency to be more confident in their capabilities than they should be. Now, before we move on to that slide, Fahim, I'd just like to go through some of these different forms of unconscious bias that I've touched on in the slides. Just want to mention a few of these. And as I read these out, perhaps you can think back to an occasion where you may have let your unconscious bias dictate how you dealt with some people, or how they dealt with you, or how you were dealt with by others because of their unconscious bias. So back to attribution bias. The question to bear in mind is, will your perception of a patient formed from your previous interactions dictate your behavior towards them, and perhaps the way you provide treatment for them? Authority bias. Are you likely to feel that the information you are being given will carry less weight if it comes from someone not in authority, or, for example, someone who may be unemployed or unqualified? Another way of looking at this is to ask yourself whether you will be more dismissive of an idea or opinion if it comes from someone whose social standing you consider to be lowly or less important. Beauty bias. As healthcare professionals, will you allow the patient's appearance to detract from the way you treat them, or is providing treatment for the patient's medical needs much more important to you than their appearance? I am sure you've had no problems relating to me due to my good looks. Or does my big nose and huge ears influence how you would treat me as a patient? Conformity bias. It is much easier for us to go along with the majority, but will you allow peer pressure from your peers to dictate how you treat someone, or will you stand up to peer pressure and deal with the patient in the way that puts the patient first? Gender bias. Members of one gender can have very strong feelings about members of another. However, will keeping out or under control your past experience of someone's gender be of help or hindrance to you in providing the necessary treatment for your patient? Another way of looking at this may be that as member of the so-called boys network influence your perception of women or men and how you treat them. Non-verbal bias. For example, when in conversation with someone from a different background, we may view non-eye contact as negative or suspicious, without considering that in their culture, eye contact may not be permitted or considered to be challenging the other person's authority, particularly the authority of someone older. Could this be part of your unconscious bias? One way of limiting some of the adverse impact of our unconscious bias is to take time out to reflect on those different to us, perhaps by putting ourselves in their shoes. This may help us to see, to think, and to feel from their perspective, and hopefully gain some understanding of how it is for them. In the Equality Act 2010, there are several protected characteristics listed. However, we are different from each other in an infinite number of ways, from the way we dress, to the food we eat or how we eat it, from the music we like to the way we like to listen to it, from what dance we like to the way we like to dance, from the team we support to what support we like to play, and so forth. It is important to remember that we don't allow others' differences, whatever they may be, to become part of our unconscious bias, dictating our attitude and our behavior towards them. The only sure way of doing this is to engage with the so-called others and learn about them and about some of our unconscious biases. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you're still all awake. Next slide, please now, Fahim. Just now over to you, really, for any questions that you might have, and some discussion that Fahim talked about earlier.
Great, thank you so much. Going to open the floor to any questions to people might have now. Hopefully that was a whistle-stop tour on unconscious bias, or UB. Just as a recap, speakers Mebs Ahmed, Mahmoud Ahmed tonight. We hope to just really answer any questions that people had about unconscious bias. I want to kick off things if people are feeling a bit shy at the moment, Mebs. We've talked about the definitions or the different ones that you described there in detail. Try and give us some things that we can go home with and inculcate in our workplace tomorrow to try and reduce these things. What suggestions, if any, do you have?
Well, I mean, this whole session was really about our own unconscious biases, not dealing with others' unconscious bias. So I think it's important to perhaps take some time out to actually reflect, maybe even tonight, some of the experiences that people have already had, and how that went, and what, were they actually aware of perhaps some of their own unconscious biases. I mean, I've sort of like gone through about 16 different forms of unconscious bias within the workplace, and I think that if we do reflect on how we've perhaps behaved with others, we may well be guilty of some of those that I've mentioned. So I think that when you're talking about we're going into work tomorrow, perhaps a quick reflection on the things that we've already done, the way we've behaved, where we've interacted with other people, have we allowed some of those unconscious biases that I've talked about influence the way we interact with others.
Okay, so we've got some questions coming in now, Mebs.
All right.
So
that's what I was afraid of.
I know. Is it possible to have no unconscious bias? That's an interesting one to start with.
Oh, I've never heard of that one before, but I suppose that the other way to look at it is to flip that and say, well, people do still have biases and they're conscious of it. So yeah, you can have conscious bias, but but you can put it down. I mean, people do sort of like behave very badly towards people that they either think are lower them in social standing, or that they are from a particular background that they don't like. So I think it's that's all conscious bias, isn't it? Some people very quick to judge people, and based on that judgment, they will sort of like then start to behave accordingly.
Okay. And moving on from that, are there any techniques that would help identify, remove unconscious biases? That's the follow-up question we've got.
Again, I take it we're talking about our own unconscious bias and techniques. The way to really deal with our own unconscious bias is to actually learn about it. To actually sort of understand what it is, what is unconscious bias, and then to explore, sort of like our own behavior at certain times of our life or certain situations, and then to decide, well, was that appropriate? Could we have done it differently? And was it because maybe I had feelings or thoughts negative about the person that I dealt with?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good to get that. In terms of obviously unconscious bias, this has come about, some people say, because of the BLM movement as well, Black Lives Matter. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Mebs? Is this a separate entity, or has it gained traction because of that?
Well, I think that anything to do with diversity and which is an umbrella of discrimination, the Black Lives Matter movement, Black Lives Matter movement has given traction to the whole agenda, and I think that it's again sort of like put it right in front of us so people can see what's happening. And will raise lots of debate and discussion around equality, diversity, and inclusion, and things like unconscious bias as well. And hopefully, I think that the way we handle other people's unconscious bias will help us to overcome that to some extent.
Okay. I like the story that you talked about, about the hamster and your friend. And I think we learn through stories often. The things we remember, even growing as a child, we actually get many messages through stories. So I like the way you did that. Is there any other sort of things people should read up about, or any other books or other things you found? Obviously, I would call you an expert on this topic of unconscious bias, but are there any things that people who have tuned in, dialed in tonight, where you would also signpost them to learn more about? Because obviously we can't do everything in one evening.
No.
But where would you say they can go next for further information?
Well, I think that people will be much more qualified to do some research on the topic. But the thing that I wanted to say was that, I mean, I'm not really comfortable with the term expert in this area. I think that I have some knowledge, limited knowledge, through your really life experience rather than anything else. But there are resources. I mean, I read a very interesting book, or I'm still reading it again. A book called Rebel Ideas by Matthew Said. And he gives really good examples of perhaps changing people's attitudes and behavior as well through dialogue and patiently addressing somebody's negative thoughts, perceptions of people from different to them. And I think it's a very skilled technique. Not everybody can do it, and it takes a while to master it. But if done right, I think through that we can change people who perhaps discriminate, perhaps judge, perhaps label others. But I think, again, it is through dialogue and discussion and debate, education.
Okay. Obviously, the concept of unconscious bias is intertwined, I guess, to a degree with equality and diversity, Mebs, if you would agree. And there's an argument put forward that having a diverse workforce can be better in terms of productivity, innovation, solutions than a homogeneous one. Is that a reason in itself to promote UB and unconscious bias, because it's good for the company, it's good for the organization, as opposed to the moral compass as to why it's happening?
Well, I think it's for both. I mean, don't forget, when you're talking about sort of like diverse workforce, diverse teams, diverse makeup of an organization, hopefully what that really does is begin conversations and dialogue and discussion. And then through those comes the education. When people start to talk to each other, really talk to each other, in an environment that isn't perhaps threatening, then people do learn. That's when people really do open up and open up to perhaps even their own closed minds and perceptions as well. So I think if you can create that kind of learning environment, much more so than I feel from certainly the past training, diversity training that I've witnessed and been made aware of. I think that there's greater learning when people, even two colleagues, can be really relaxed and know each other and can start to talk about difference. That's where the learning occurs. And what we need is lots and lots and lots of conversations like that. So, but I work, as I mentioned, I work for the police service and I led on workforce representation. And at the beginning of that process for me, it was about making as much change as possible to the Lancashire Constabulary's workforce. But that in itself is not the entire solution, because at the end of the day, you want quality of service. And I will not sit here and say that actually you can only get quality of service if you've got people represented from all sorts of backgrounds. Quality of service comes from the individual. And, whether they're black, white, brown, whatever background they're from, it's the quality of the person that will ultimately deliver the quality of service to all our diverse communities. And therefore, it's important for us to educate our colleagues about ourselves, about our culture, our background, but also to learn and exchange those ideas.
Okay. In terms of, obviously, you've always got lived experience, which is what you're able to pass on. There's an argument to be made, obviously, for an evening like this, that the people who are here are the ones who don't need to be here. Because obviously they're tuned in, they're aware of this as perhaps a blind spot, something they want to learn about. But in a way, you want to help the people who aren't interested in this topic, aren't here, and those of us who are here and wish to pass on the baton or relay that information to them. How do we go about that?
Well, that's the real challenge we face, isn't it? I mean, it's fine talking to people, sort of like already converted in bracket commas, if you like. The challenge is actually to talk to people who perhaps don't buy into equality, diversity, and inclusion, and don't see that they may be discriminating in some way. But that's through building relationships, meaningful relationships, and you build those relationships first by earning people's trust. And, I think that every one of us can go and perhaps talk to somebody that maybe they didn't talk to before, and maybe, start to have dialogue and discussion, and perhaps, look and seek ways of earning somebody's trust. A good police officer from a BME background, will be able to relate to his white colleagues, because they'll see him or her as somebody who's really effective and good at their job. So they'll want to engage with them. But unfortunately, the flip side of that is that one minority officer, a bad one, will get the whole, unfortunately, community or group tarred very badly in the eyes of, our white colleagues, because, oh, well, it's an Asian officer or whatever. So I think there is that little bit of pressure on us to sort of like, go above and beyond. And yes, we can say it's not fair, and it isn't, because we all just want to do our job, and perhaps nothing more. But, when you're being discriminated against, you've got to do something about it. And I know that you and I had this discussion, and perhaps it feels unfair for the discriminated against to actually do something about it. But it should be the discriminators should be doing something about it. But if they were going to do something about it, they wouldn't do that in the first place. So whether it's because they have an educational need, whether it's because their mind or needs broadening, whatever it is, whatever reason, whether, I mean, okay, some people can say, well, they just don't like other groups of people. But that then we have obviously, the policies and procedures and processes to deal with those sort of things. But we've got to stand up and raise them.
Okay.
Do you
have a question?
How to use new safety plan feature in XCP? How does that look like for our service users on the front end? And how to remove it?
Sorry, I'm not sure if someone's asking a question or they just unmuted themselves. So Mebs, obviously we've talked through a lot of the actual different concepts to do with this. There's also an argument that from some of the research and things that I've shared with you as well prior to tonight, Mebs, I think you know what I'm referring to, that unconscious bias training has an impact in areas outside of healthcare, but in healthcare it may be of limited impact for various reasons. What do you make of that assertion?
Well, I'd like to understand what those reasons would be in the healthcare, because again, being a somebody from outside the healthcare profession field, I think that for me, whatever field of work you work in, people are people. Yes, they're all at all different kinds of levels, but if they have prejudices and if they have have labeled people and judged people, whatever profession they're in, they're going to need dealing with. And I did mention the training aspect of it before. I think that we need perhaps a thorough review of equality, diversity, and inclusion training. Does it actually do what it is required? In the past, for me, it hasn't. Now, I've been out of this field for a number of years now, and things may well have changed considerably that I'm not aware of. But talking to a lot of my colleagues and other people that from other professions, it doesn't feel like it. So I think that it's about time we did have a thorough review of training when it comes to equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think that we really do need to create, what we all call safe learning environments, but I know that they really haven't been those safe learning environments that we desire, because I've been in many training occasions where people just sit there and don't say a word because they're still terrified of opening their mouth and something wrong comes out and then they'll be labeled. So there is no learning for them because they just sat there and just gone through the process rather than actually being engaged, actively being engaged and participating in the discussions. So I think that that's what we need to do. So I don't think it really matters what profession or field people are in. I think that still needs to happen.
That's great. I want to share with the audience something that I came across prior to tonight, and that was to do with ways to avoid unconscious bias. Obviously, certain things that we can do is obviously being aware. And I came across this by the acas.org.uk ACAS website. Advertising a job vacancy in at least 2 different places to reach a wide range of people from different backgrounds. I found that one quite interesting, actually, and it's something that I would do moving forwards. Getting recruiting managers to agree to make each other aware if they notice stereotyping. Holding back some details on job application forms, such as the applicant's name or sex. This is called blind sifting. That could affect recruiting managers' opinions. Coming back to the name bias that you referred to, Mebs. Where possible, having one of the interviewers on the phone so they do not make decisions based on the physical appearance of the person being interviewed. So maybe going into that beauty bias. I mean, these are just some possible solutions I came across. At each stage, having more than one person sifting job applications, interviewing the applicants and deciding who gets the job. Allowing time to make decisions, for example, on recruitment, promotions, or grievance and disciplinary outcomes, and keeping a written record of why decisions were made. I think that's all great advice. What do you make of all that, Mebs?
I think some of that is happening. I know that in the police service, when they're talking about advertising, what they do is actually target lots of different minority communities, not just sort of like on the race side, but actually lots of different minority communities. They have officers that engage and build up a relationship with them. So when a vacancy does come up, actually it's advertised there as well as sort of like through the usual forums. So I think that's happening, and I think also the sort of like the blind application forms that are sifted as well. That's happening in certainly in some of the governmental departments. It's happening as well. I mean, I noticed some. In fact, going through some of the recruitment processes, or for example, passport officers, they actually do. They ask for sort of like a statement about the role and why you would be suitable, but no the details are asked for. So they haven't got your name, so that goes straight to the person who's paper sifting. But when it comes to, when you say, I think that there should be two people reviewing. I think you mentioned something about 2 people involved. I think that's down to practicality. I would say that you need to train people better, and you need to give particularly recruitment teams, they need to have this unconscious bias training, definitely, because they need to be made aware of their own unconscious bias and biases. And I think if you do that, yes, then there should be quality assurance, because you can still have people trained and they may still have those biases. But if you've got quality assurance that randomly pick out, whether it's paper sifting, whether it's interviews, whatever it is, and ensures that nothing untoward has happened, that they've been thoroughly.
Great. Coming up to the last few minutes really of tonight's session. If anyone wishes to unmute at this stage and ask a question of Mebs, feel free to do so. Any final comments you wish to make, Mebs, then in summary as well then, just whilst we wait for anyone who may wish to ask anything else? Well,
we talked a little bit about, sort of like further solutions and looking at other people's unconscious bias. I think for that it really is for me is more a session around people who want to take the next step and sit down and explore how do we go about doing that. I think there's a question coming up. I think I've seemed to have, somebody's got their hand up. Rihanna.
Go ahead, Rihanna.
Good evening. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I just wanted to go back to Fahim, just to ask what you meant about the being limited impact of unconscious bias training, the NHS, what you meant about that. If you could explain more, because I would have thought in the NHS, just as probably with the police, there's lots of institutional racism and bias, and it's needed there more than ever.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question, Rihanna. So there was some research which I'll actually put on the group chat, and I'll put it on actually the end of the biography of this YouTube clip. And I was reading it, as did Mebs, and it was about implicit bias in healthcare, clinical practice, research and decision making. And I read the whole paper, which has over 100 references in it. And when you come to the end of it, I don't know if you've come across it, Rihanna, but it does mention that, from my understanding of the paper, that it's a bit limited how unconscious bias training can affect in some healthcare settings. So what I'll do, let me get that paper, I'll put it on the link. You can have a read of it. It takes a bit of a time to get through it, which is why us doing this session is a bit different, because it is definitely, I think there's a remit and room for it to work outside of healthcare. But from what I read from that paper, I was, well, should I put it, just a bit more circumspect. And that was one of the things that led to this meeting coming about. But I hope that answers the question, Rihanna.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mebs, you are finishing your summary.
Yeah, I think that for me, when you were asking me about, how do we take this forward, and I've put things down for next step as well. I think that, the next step for me, it really depends on the people that are listening in. What do they want to do? If they want to sort of look at addressing other people's unconscious bias, then we need to really explore that further with them on perhaps even on an individual basis, and sort of look to, explore that with them, ask them a number of questions, and look at what sort of support mechanisms that there are in place, who their diversity champions are, what sort of, how do they get involved with this internal staff support networks, how do they get involved with external networks and support, because I think that this is, as Rihanna has just mentioned, it's not just in the National Health Service, it's not just in the police service, it's going on across the country. So I think that we need to perhaps get our heads together and look at coming up with something that's universal, if you like.
Yeah, that's true. We do need to come up with something universal. If anyone else has any further ideas how we can move forward with this sort of concept, either in healthcare, outside healthcare, home, workplace, happy for any questions on that. Okay, I think we're just coming up to 8 o'clock. I want to give a big thanks to you, Mebs, again, for giving up your time and speaking about this topic. 45 minutes or so obviously doesn't do justice to the topic, we know that, but it is an introduction and it started some dialogue, which is what we were hoping to do. And I hope that it's led to some people at least rethinking about the topic. For those of you who stayed, thank you so much for your time and attention. And I look forward to hosting you at a separate and different meeting at another time. Many thanks and a good evening.